everybody. So we have all the boys back today. Jacob Skepis from JPS Health and Fitness, Steve Hall from Revive Stronger. So welcome back, guys.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
So we finally coordinated everybody's schedule. I think this is like the third or fourth attempt to get this one going. But the people have spoken. They wanted another roundtable. And so first one was kind of coaching generally. Then we did nutrition. And so today is going to be more about training. And so to start off, obviously, the first thing you need to select is your exercises. And we were talking a little bit about how on like the very base level, it's, pick your compounds, fill in with isolations, and then you can get really advanced with exercise selection and get into like these really unique exercises. Dante Trudell from DC Training is big on, he has this quote, get weird with it. And he gets people to find really unique exercises for them and try to target in a certain way. John Meadows is also kind of big on that, where he has, a lot of stories about how his back didn't grow until he started doing Meadows rows and things like that. So where do you guys fall in that? You think you need to be very specific for an individual's anatomy, or you just think stick with the big ones?
You go, Jacob.
Screw you, Steve. Throw me under the bus like that.
I know you've got some in-depth thoughts on this, nuance.
Not quite. But yeah, I think firstly, what a lot of people don't appreciate about resistance training is that it's a skill, and within any movement or gross complex motor pattern, there's a lot of learning that needs to occur for somebody to be able to move not only correctly and meet the positional demands of certain lifts, so having the mobility, stability, strength, control, coordination, but then to be able to express a lot of force. And we know that for muscle growth, we obviously need sufficient fiber tension on, at the fiber level. We need adequate magnitude and durations of that tension, and also sufficient exposure, which is volume to that tension. And I think when we look to selecting exercises, we need to remember that strength is highly specific to the movement being trained. So the load, absolute load, the range of motion, all those sorts of things. Whereas hypertrophy is not exercise specific. It's a tension dependent process, not an exercise dependent process. And that means that exercise selection can be very individualized, and we've got a lot of tools at our disposal. And I think, as you mentioned, a lot of people take a really reductionist perspective on exercise selection. They basically put together a program around multi-joint lifts, such as your squat, your hinge, your horizontal push and pull, and your vertical push and pull, and then they use their isolations to fill in the gaps. And I think that's fine for the most part, but I also think that there's a lot more complexity to it once you have dialed in, the very base level of proficiency within those movement patterns, and we can get into that a little bit more. But just to sort of lay out the foundations and a framework for what the pros and cons of multi-joints and isolation movements are. I guess compound movements, meaning that we have compounding tension on the joints, so multiple joints working, trains many muscle groups, which means it's more time efficient. So they're the benefits of multi-joint exercises. Think of a squat, we're getting a lot of stimulus on the quads, there's a bit of hamstrings, glutes, erectors, even upper back, things like that. Then we have, drawbacks of multi-joint lifts are that some muscle groups might not receive optimal stimulus to maximize hypertrophy. So if we're doing just a lot of like horizontal pressing, for example, we get plenty of tension on, the pecs, anterior delts, and the triceps. But if we're not doing any lateral raises, in combined with that, we're not getting stimulus on the lateral head of the delt. There's often a large learning curve, as I mentioned, and movement proficiency with barbell work. Like people need to, as I mentioned, have the mobility, the stability, strength, control, and coordination, to meet the positional demands. And that can take a lot of time before you're getting a decent amount of stimulus with those kind of exercises. And it may not structurally suit some people. And in many cases, they carry a greater injury risk if they're performed incorrectly, and can cause more central fatigue, which could limit fiber recruitment. When we look at isolation movements, obviously the benefits are that it doesn't take long to learn those kind of exercises. You throw someone on a leg extension, they generally pick it up in a couple of sessions. We can fill in the gaps and make sure that we're stimulating the muscles that aren't getting trained in those multi-joint lifts. They generally have a lower absolute load requirement, meaning that they're a little bit more joint friendly, potentially less fatiguing overall, and the changes in performance are often more indicative of changes in muscle growth. So that's a really big benefit of your single joint exercises, because if we're progressing on a leg extension, chances are that we're building some muscle in the quads. Whereas if we're progressing on a squat, a lot of that progression could be neural, all those sorts of things. And the drawbacks of isolation movements are that they're not as time efficient as our multi-joint lifts, and they can't optimize the stimulus for every muscle group. So for example, the vastus lateralis and vastus medialis better activate with squats and leg extensions. So there's some things to think about, and I'm sure Steve's got a few ideas that he might want to throw in there now.
Cool. Yeah, I think you made some amazing points, and I don't really have anything to add to those points. Like, I think you just gave a great foundation. I just have something. The way I always like to analogize it to clients when they have a think about, like, I don't know, they put certain exercises on a pedestal. They go like, oh, squats, you have to do like a barbell back squat. It's like, well, why can't we do a hack squat or a Smith machine squat? Why can't we do these other movements? And the way I like to analogize it, because a lot of people have this familiarity with flexible dieting in that you can eat like lean beef, turkey, chicken, whey protein, egg whites. Like, they're much of a muchness. You're going to get protein, essentially, lean protein. Same with if you're going to get a squat pattern. I would say a squat pattern is pretty important for big quads. If you can do one, brilliant. It doesn't have to be a barbell though. It could be front squats, back squats, a hack squat, whatever it might be. So I always like that to be an analogy for people, so they realize, okay, it's kind of like the body doesn't know that I'm doing a back squat. It just knows I'm doing a squat pattern, just like it doesn't know if I'm eating turkey or chicken. So I like to tell people that. And then I really like Mark Ripito. I've read it ages ago in Practical Programming, where he was like, when you're first new to lifting, you kind of focus on a small number of exercises, kind of get proficient at a squat pattern, a hip hinge, a row, an overhead press, that sort of thing. Then as you go through intermediate, you can expand and try different exercises, try loads, try the cables, try the machines, try different grips, everything. Then as you progress, your mind-muscle connection gets better. You find what exercises work really well for you, and then you're advanced. And maybe you have like 4 exercises for each muscle group, and maybe you rotate between those because you know they're your bread and butter and they're going to work really well for you, for your body type and how you respond, whether that's kind of, your anatomy and things like this. So that's always like 2 points I like to add on top of kind of what you said there, which I think is great.
Yeah.
So, and I'm glad you brought in the mind muscle connection thing, because you and I talked about that a little bit last time. And I think, I could debate on whether, these like professional bodybuilders, they really had this amazing mind muscle connection, or is it just, the genetics and drugs and all that. But I would say, I think you can individualize your exercise selection, but you probably don't need to focus on that at first. I mean, if you're benching 135 or, your first year of training, just don't worry about that, in my opinion. Get up to, the actual numbers are, of course, going to depend on the individual person. But, if I see somebody, there was a guy I remember at my old gym, and he'd come in, he had like every piece of like lifting equipment you could have on. He probably had like $200 of like equipment on, and then like the Addy Power shoes, all these things. And then he warmed up, and then he ended up squatting like 185. And it's like, it's not, to like demean the guy or anything. It's just, that's so excessive at that beginner level. I just don't think you need to worry about it. I do think you should start with the core exercises that everybody talks about, unless you have some serious issue with them that causes a problem, which, very few people do initially. And then after that, after you've been doing this for a few years, maybe you see, oh, this grip works a little bit different for me. I feel this a little bit better. Or this machine, I definitely think from a hypertrophy standpoint, it's completely fine to use machines. I really don't think, all the dogma about having to stick with the big 3 matters from a hypertrophy standpoint. And then, I think over time you can focus on things. And I actually think once you've developed that base, sticking even with like the really big compounds isn't completely essential. I think you should always do them. But what I mean is, like, I've had a period where I couldn't do like really heavy squats and deadlifts. So I had to stick with leg press, and really I was doing 100% machines. And I was thinking like, man, this is going to suck. Everything's going to go backwards. And it didn't. Like, my quads still went up proportionally with everything else. I mean, it was fine. Or I should say my thigh circumference, it went up just fine. So I do think there's a lot of dogma that people kind of put out there with sticking with the compounds forever, like the main compounds, the barbell compounds. I think initially it's great, but you can progress from that.
Yeah. So I definitely agree. I think individuals should start with a very basic program, and then identify, which movements they feel the most, which movements cause them, a lot more fatigue, a disproportionate amount of fatigue, in comparison to the stimulus they're getting from the exercise, otherwise known as the stimulus to fatigue ratio. Mike Israetel talks about quite a bit. But I think also, we need to understand that the training effect in the gym is going to be largely influenced by the exercises we choose. And what I mean by that, I'm sure the listeners have all heard people say that not all volume is created equally. 5 sets of squats at an RP of 9 is very different to 5 sets of 10 on the leg extension at an RP 9. And this makes sense at a really basic level. It's like, okay, squats are a multi-joint lift, leg extensions are a single joint lift, but other variables outside of volume influence the training effect. And as I discussed before, so the exercise mechanics and force vectors, so not only the number of joints used, but the muscles that are stressed the most, the distribution of tension at various muscle lengths. So when tension is highest, whether it's in a lengthened position or a contracted position, so the muscle is short, the contraction type, within the exercises, so whether it's a concentric, like isometric, eccentrics, and that's related more so to the execution of a lift. But I think those kind of factors really play a part once an individual starts to progress. And we can think about it like this: if somebody wants to train the glutes using a hip thrust, where the biomechanics of the movement is such that we're seeing a peak contraction of the glutes at the top of the rep range where the muscles are shortened, that's a very different type of stimulus to, in say, an RDL, when we're taking the muscle through longer lengths, and that's just a lot more fatiguing. So I think, we need to keep those things in mind, and just look at not just the peripheral fatigue within the muscle when we're selecting movements to be a part of our program, but also the other fatigue, so central fatigue, nervous system fatigue, all those sorts of things, because that can massively influence recovery rates, adaptation, and just the overall structure of a program. If somebody's training, their glutes and they're doing RDLs, hip thrusts, all these sorts of movements within the one session, that can be really, really demanding. Whereas if they're, splitting up that volume across multiple sessions, or potentially selecting exercises that just have, a lower magnitude, of load, such as reverse hypers or banded work, that'll play a large part in, not only the type of training effect they get, but how much volume they need, as well as the recovery that comes with that and the subsequent adaptation. So I think, it's just important to keep those things in mind. As someone begins to advance and they're looking to incorporate more variety into their workout, not just throwing the entire kitchen sink at their program, and having all these really, hard, overloading and stressful exercises, but understanding the utility and potential drawbacks of these less fatiguing movements that are not necessarily going to have the same training effect, but can be incorporated to contribute to muscle growth in the same way that those larger compound movements can.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned, of course, how not all volume is the same. I mean, even within the same exercise, right? Like when it came out, years back, that you could do lower weight and higher volume, even 60%, sometimes even 30% if you have blood flow restriction. But I think we'd all agree that you can't just use 30% and just do 10 sets of 10. I mean, that's just not going to be any stimulus, right? So even if you added up the volume load, it's not equivalent. There needs to be that intensity. So even in studies when they talk about the volume for a certain muscle group, right? Is a bench press count as one set for your triceps, or is it half the set for triceps? We don't have clear guidelines there. We can just kind of estimate. But how do you guys go about even setting the volume for, let's say, somebody who you just started training with? It doesn't have to be somebody who's new to training, but maybe they're new with you. How do you even get a gauge for what's appropriate for them?
Well, based on Schoenfeld's study, 45 sets for every man from the get-go.
All the failure.
Yeah.
And then we get rhabdo.
They get rhabdo.
Super compensation and then delayed muscle growth. That's what we get. It's all good.
Right. Just sip your BCAAs and you'll be good.
There you go.
So I'll start. And I mean, for someone who comes to me as a new client, I always have a consultation with them, get an idea of what their past training history has been. So whether they've been high volume, low volume, or whereabouts they're sitting and how good is their volume and things like this. Quite often I have to reset them. So I have people, they'll be at either end. There'll be some people really low and they're just going to failure all the time. There'll be other people who come to me who are maybe their intensity is not there, or maybe the exercise selection just isn't, it's kind of wanting more. They're not really doing like big band per buck movements like the compound moves. They're kind of missing out that hard stuff as many people talk about it. So when we talk about volume, it is really tricky. Like you said, even a barbell bench press is like, do you account that to your triceps or just chest? It's kind of like, well, it depends. For me personally, I don't get much tricep out of a bench press. It's like all pec, whereas someone else, it could be all tricep. So it's very individual in that regard. So as a baseline for most people, obviously looking into their background, but starting at that kind of 10 sets per muscle group as kind of the literature's pointing to at the moment, and then maybe kind of pushing up slightly or pushing down slightly depending on their background and history, and always being more so on the cautious side. So I always tend to be lower on legs anyway for people. So it might be 6 sets for like hamstrings, more like 8 sets for quads, and then upper bodies typically more so like 12 for the average person maybe. But yeah, sitting around that 10 sets, and then that's not 10 sets of like bicep work, say. I do attribute some of their pulling movements to that, where there is crossover and things like that. And then it's a sense of, I really like to find someone's minimum effective volume or minimum effective dose in a sense, because I like to start mesocycles at relatively high RARs. So maybe like 3 reps in reserve, sitting around there where we know that's still going to provide stimulus so long as we have sufficient volume. And then I'm trying to identify with that person, are you kind of getting fatigue in that muscle group? Are you feeling maybe any like soreness? Are you feeling any kind of the next day you feel like you've actually trained it? Are you getting any pumps during those workouts? Are you getting like strong pumps, or are you getting weak ones, or just it doesn't feel like you trained it at all? And basically that first week, I want someone to feel like they've gone in, they provided a stimulus, but they're not destroyed, and it was pretty comfortable for them. That's where I want to achieve week 1. And in that week, I'm also, especially if they're a new client, it's a case of get recording of their form on everything, because you can never be sure. And even people who've been lifting 5 years, you can be surprised at their form and intent on movements, and you're just like, right, I can see why you could do so many legs of leg press when you only come down half the way. Like if we could chop your sets in half if you come all the way down. So that's where I tend to start people anyway.
Cool.
Yeah, I think Steve brought up a lot of really good points there. And just to make sure that the listeners are on the same page with us when we talk about volume, I think we need to first look at like what volume is and what its role is in hypertrophy. So volume in a really broad sense is the overall dosing of the training stress across like whatever time frame, session, microcycle, mesocycle, macrocycle, and intensity, both absolute and relative. Like that's a primary determinant of the training effect. So the amount of sets and reps we do is the dosing of that effect. And as we know, we've seen a dose-response relationship between weekly set volume and hypertrophy, and there seems to be a cap on that volume where we start to see diminishing returns. And volume is essentially, measured in the number of hard sets or effective reps that we achieve, within a training session or a week or a mesocycle, and basically describes the high threshold fiber impulse, which is force times time, and where force is a result of the intensity and time is the total amount of sets we perform. So generally speaking, when I begin working with somebody new, as Steve said, it's very much a discussion around what have they been doing previously, and like Steve said, what is the quality of that volume. And I'll typically have someone run an intro week or like a transition microcycle where we have very low training volumes, and we're just trying to acclimate to new exercises and induce the repeated bout effect. So like Steve mentioned, having minimal soreness, dialing in the technique, making sure that everything's on point. But then generally, it's going to depend on how frequently somebody can train as well. So not just how much they've been doing previously and working from there, but how often they can get to the gym. So if somebody can only get to the gym 3 times, that's going to really impact how much volume I can dedicate to a specific muscle group versus somebody who's able to get to the gym 6 times. And we can see that within a session, volume tends to see a very significant increase in hypertrophy, anywhere from 3 to 10 sets. and more than 8 to 10 sets within a workout, there appears to be plateau and regression. So we need to be cognizant of that. So if somebody's training 3 times a week and we want to do, train each muscle group, say twice a week, and we need to get 10 sets per muscle group within those sessions, those are going to be some very long sessions. So it's very much a balancing act with their time availability, not only within the session, but within the week. But moving from there, if they're training once a week, like I mentioned, we can get up to 10 hard sets body part. But if they're training twice a week or stimulating muscle twice a week, anywhere from 10 to 20 sets is a good bang for buck figure. And if they're training 3 times a week or more, we can start to scale the volume up even more so. But generally, starting on the low end, anywhere from 6 to 10 hard sets per week, watching their recovery and their performance. So what I really like to do is I will have their first session of the week be more of a baseline session that we're assessing performance in, and the second session of the week will basically allow for a little bit of recovery, generally lower intensities, both absolute and relative, and we can assess performance every week in that first session. And if performance in that first session is climbing, we can continue to add volume to the second session because that's our proxy for performance. And if their performance starts to slow down or regress to the point that they're taking weight off the bar, not able to perform the same load, reps and sets, and fatigue and recovery is becoming an issue, we can start to either decrease volume in that second session or potentially relative intensity. So yeah, that's just some of my thoughts, and that's obviously an example for someone who's training with a frequency of twice a week. But for the most part, I like to start with the minimum effective dose and then work up to their maximum adaptive volume. But once I sort of reach anywhere within their minimum effective dose and their maximum recoverable volume, so the range of their maximum adaptive volume, once I find a sweet spot that things are progressing quite nicely, I'll generally keep volume constant and look to progress reps, sets, and increase their proximity to failure using the RPE scale.
Yeah, I was going to ask you guys how you go about progressing the stimulus once you have that initial one set up. And that one is an interesting one to me because right now everyone is talking about, especially with Mike Israetel becoming much more popular recently, these volume landmarks. And I know, Steve, you have a pretty big range from where you start to when you end a cycle there. For me, I see a lot of people who are huge on low volume. There's a lot of people who are huge on high volume. I do think, of course, you need to have a progression over time. But even for the low volume advocates, right, they're still adding weight. They're trying to get a rep here and there. Of course, overall, the volume load is generally increasing. And if you saw the recent one with Lyle McDonald, he's saying how he thinks everybody's going to be proven wrong in the future and that, volume is not the primary driver, that it is intensity and load. And I could see both arguments. Certainly when you control for an intensity, the more volume up to a point, the more the person will grow. But of course, you can't just stick with a low weight and just do more and more volume. Eventually, everybody who's really big tends to be really strong. With some rare exceptions.
So that's why Steve's so small. I always wondered why.
I'm not strong. You call me strong. I'm taking the benefit.
So I just, at least when I was first getting into this, so many people were low volume advocates. Again, Dante Trudell talks so much about how just get really strong on these few key exercises. I don't know if I really buy into the super high volumes at least for natural athletes. Not that I think they're going to hurt, but I know, I don't know if I was telling you this, Steve, or somebody else, but when I had done a high volume phase for my back because I kind of hurt my pec, so I literally backed it down to 4 sets for chest for the entire week. And honestly, it still kind of went up just as it always had. I kind of got back up to my peak strength. It wasn't a huge difference. So I don't know if you guys have noticed massive differences in experimenting with higher volume, but for me, it's yeah, maybe for strength, if I'm doing I did a military press specialization phase, and that got me to the strongest I'd ever been. I was doing 30 sets of overhead press a week. But I wouldn't say my shoulders got massively bigger. I just got better at the exercise,
Cool. So I guess I'll jump in first because you mentioned I work between quite a large range. So
Mhm.
yeah, for me, like for my quads, for example, I can probably find from the start of a mesocycle, I can get away with maybe as low as maybe 3 or 4 sets within a single session to be my minimum effective volume. So maybe 6 to 8 as my minimum effective volume, and I can work that up to close to 20 by the end of the mesocycle. And that is quite a good gap, and which is great because if in theory that means I have a big amount of time between maximal recoverable volume and minimum effective volume, which means there's a long time in maximal adaptive volume. So that's the max rate you can grow at. So I like that. And I think I've managed to maybe get that because I'm a bit of a unique individual in that I'm self-employed. I can manage my time really effectively. I'm really in control of my meals. I'm really in control of my sleep. I don't have kids. I don't have other commitments that I have to abide by. So I can be very, very selfish about my own recoverability and things like this, to the point of which I can do morning and evening workouts, which obviously someone like Jacob definitely can't do. So like
Get a
that
job,
hampers,
Steve.
yeah, that hampers someone's maximal recoverable volume a lot. So some people, like Jacob, has kids and family and a business and it can be busy. I have clients who work really long hours, who cannot commit many sessions to the gym. And whilst on paper, they'd have really high maximal recoverable volumes, they should be able to grow excellently. Unfortunately, they're hampered by other factors. Like they always say, stress is stress is stress. Everything's going to take away from your ability to recover, from late nights out to late nights at work to stress with your wife and kids. All of these things are going to hamper recovery. So if you haven't got your I's crossed, I mean, your T's crossed and your I's dotted, then you could well have a much lower MRV than you'd expect. And therefore your ability to grow is much more hampered. So for me personally, when I started utilizing this idea of, oh, I can increase via sets and I can move between kind of minimum effective to maximal recoverable, my results have been never better. And so I've committed to that because it's just worked wonderfully. And when I think about what leads to maximal hypertrophy, it is probably the training that in the long term gets you the strongest. So in the short term, and Jacob kind of talked about it off air, where he hadn't trained that much. And so he kind of tapered and then hit a PB on his big lifts. And great, like short term, that can work. But you don't want to get that wrong and miscued and think, okay, this is the way we have to train because this leads to maximal kind of strength within the hypertrophy rep ranges. So that's max growth. In the long term, that wouldn't pan out. So working with higher volumes seems to pan out better as a better solution for getting stronger in the higher repetition ranges in the long run. So that's how I tend to go about things. And moving between weeks, I auto-regulate for myself, for all my clients. So it's I never pre-program set increases. It will be whether or not I feel recovered. So if I come into like a leg session and I feel fully fresh, I perform really well, then probably my next leg for quads, I'll end up adding a set, similar to how James Krieger describes. If he's not sore and he's performing well and everything's indicating that he can benefit from more volume and he has the time to, then he'll end up adding it. So I'm very much the same. But even in a workout, and I don't necessarily do this with many of my clients, maybe more of the advanced ones, I've had this discussion. But even in a workout like week 1, if I feel like, okay, I had programmed 4 sets, but I've already got a sick pump from 2 sets, I ain't doing more. I'm holding off so that in future weeks I can add sets. And similarly, if I'm in a latter in a mesocycle and I'm already trashed after programmed 4 sets and I've done 3, I won't do that 4th set. I'm like, okay, I know I've got a sufficient stimulus for that muscle group. That's all I need. I don't need more. So I very much like the idea of taking what I need rather than taking everything, because that allows for progression and overload today and progression and overload in future. And every week can be different. So I've had clients where they've had like a week off work and everything is like zooming up. And it's like, so next week we're going to add a set to everything. No, you're back at work. Let's be smart about this. Probably recovery capability is going to be way hampered. So let's maybe add just a couple here or there. So that's the way I tend to move through things. And in my experience, clients have really enjoyed that process. It's led to great results. And theoretically, if you're starting at minimum effective and then just auto-regulating and adding up with the idea that volume is the key marker for muscle growth in the long term, then there's no kind of theoretical downside to it at the moment. So that's the way I like to do things, at least.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So Steve brought up a lot of really good points. And if we strip things back, I think we need to always remember what the physiological training objective for hypertrophy is. So as I mentioned earlier, we need sufficient magnitude of tension. So basically, that is the load that we use. We don't grow just walking around, resisting gravity as it is. We need some additional load
enough.
on the muscles. Depends how
You're
big you are and how far you walk. But we know that we need a sufficient magnitude of tension with a sufficient duration of tension that leads to the hypertrophy signal. So basically that will mean we need some heavy loading. We need to train with relative intensity that is close to failure, RPEs of 6 or more, and we need sufficient exposure, so volume to the above. And stemming from there, if we remember back to our very basic S&C exercise science lectures and studies, the main determinant of mechanical loading is the force velocity relationship. So high forces at slow velocities, and that means that fiber activation and getting a tension stimulus is not just dependent upon the load on the bar. However, I'm going to get to why load progression is important in a minute, but we have a number of ways that we can get muscle bigger. So we can either do more reps, more sets, or more load. And in terms of progressing the stimulus, I think once we have the base level of volume that we require, which we can otherwise define as the minimum effective volume, the amount of work performed, which is what hypertrophy is primarily related to, being reps times sets times load times distance traveled, including that relative intensity threshold, it's less specific to the exact intensity range or the movement performed, meaning that we can build muscle in a number of different ways. Load progression is not the only way. But in saying that, I think we need to then understand what happens when we stimulate a muscle. So the relationship between adaptation and the necessity of future overload. So with exposure to this mechanical loading, there's a temporal decline in fitness. We know that. Recovery processes take place. We get restoration and then adaptation. And the 4 primary adaptations that take place alongside coordination are increase in muscle fiber size, increase in the ability of each muscle fiber to produce force relative to its size, increase in the number of muscle fibers that are activated because of an enhanced capacity to reach full motor unit recruitment, and increase in tendon stiffness. So what does that mean? Well, that means we need to add load for the same reps and sets, or add reps with the same load and sets, or add sets with the same load or reps. And I think, again, a lot of people think that there's these wildly different programming styles that exist, such as Steve's ramping of, training volume in adding sets across the course of a mesocycle versus, somebody like Eric Helms, who might use more of a dynamic double progression where we, add reps first, then load, and we auto-regulate within that. But at the end of the day, they're both achieving the physiological objective of training for hypertrophy. They are increasing the magnitude of tension and or the duration of tension, which means the muscle will grow. So I think it's very much a case of how do you understand your system, and how best do you go about applying that system in practice to the real world, and more importantly, how does it apply to the individual that you have at hand? Like Steve mentioned, when you have wild fluctuations in somebody's allostatic load, so that their tolerance to stress, progressing load with adding progressing the stimulus by adding sets is going to mean a significant amount of training stimulus. So we know that adding sets is going to have the largest increase in the stimulus when compared to like adding a rep, although that adding a rep will have a different effect depending on the rep range that you're performing. For example, if you are doing a 3x5 and you add 1 rep, that's going to be a sufficiently larger increase in the stimulus when compared to adding a rep at 3x15 going to 3x16. So I think all these things need to be considered, but at the end of the day, they're all achieving very similar physiological, outcomes, and it's horses for courses type scenario. And more importantly, when we look to the individuals that we work with, this is something I definitely do and have become more cognizant of over the years, is the importance of understanding the neurophysiological backdrop of that person, meaning their ability to tolerate stress is going to be either high, moderate, or low. Very simplistic classifications there. And it can be either very consistent or very inconsistent. For example, myself, my ability to tolerate stress is quite high, However, the daily and weekly fluctuations in my stress levels are, significant, meaning that it's very hard to predict when we drop in the training stress, on my body, what's going to happen, and predicting the, rate of adaptation, my recovery abilities is just going to vary markedly depending on what's going on in my life. However, you might have someone like Steve who has, quite a moderate, I would say, tolerance to stress, but super predictable. He's, got the same routine day in, day out. He's got everything in his life dialed in, meaning that when we drop that stress in, it's going to be quite a, ticking boxes kind of scenario where we know what's going to happen. We can predict with a high degree of certainty what those outcomes are going to be. And therefore, when we have set progression, where there is a large magnitude of stress when compared to, say, a rep progression or a dynamic double progression, we can use those sorts of things with individuals who have either a high tolerance to stress or B, a very consistent and predictable, backdrop of their, allostatic load and tolerance to stress. So yeah, they're just some things that I always consider when I look to the progression models that I use. But I'm a big fan of, like I said, starting a mesocycle with low to moderate volumes, which will generally be at somebody's minimum effective dose, moving up to a maximum adaptive volume, or just below, anywhere within that range from MEV to MRV, sorry. And from there, I'm just going to really gauge, what's happening on a daily and weekly basis as to whether they need more sets, less sets, and potentially just, looking to increase the tension in whatever way we can. Because like I mentioned earlier, there are a multitude of ways we can do that. We can add reps, we can add load, we can add sets, we can increase range of motion. So we don't need to have this, dichotomy in how we program for hypertrophy, because it simply is a very complex process. But from what we know in the literature, which is fuck all, to be honest, but what I've seen in practice, it gives us a lot of tools to achieve the same end outcome. And I think once people start to realize this, they'll start to, look a little bit more holistically at program design, and they'll stop putting people in boxes. More importantly, this is, Mike Israetel, MEV to MRV, and Eric Helms, conservative. It's like, yeah, I don't think that they're necessarily conservative or assertive. They may be at a very superficial level, but they're just different ways of achieving the same physiological objective when we train for hypertrophy. So sorry for the ramble, but that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out, if you look at Steve, when was the last time you competed, you said?
2017.
17, okay. So, and we talked before about, if you compete in 2020, you're hoping maybe somewhere between like 3 to 5 pounds heavier on stage, right?
Yeah, like I want as much as I can get. If I can get anywhere close to that, that would be great. I still feel like I'll be disappointed if I'm only like 3 pounds heavier, but realistically.
So let's say it's like 4 pounds, right? And we're talking 4 pounds over about 3-year time span, right? So that is including, of course, like all like the sleep you've had, like the nutrition you've had, the life stress you've had. When we're talking about the difference between, let's say the training that you're doing is 100% optimal for you. Even if you didn't have this volume progression, right? You just kind of kept the basic principles in there and everything else that we talk about. It might be, in my opinion, instead of 4 pounds, maybe it was 3.5 pounds. It's not like this is, 2 pounds of muscle over a year versus 10 pounds. So I just think people need to keep that in mind.
Where are you going, man? It's all gut residue. As soon as Steve brings his calories down, he's going to weigh the exact same on stage and look like he doesn't even lift.
But yeah, just keep in mind that like when we're talking about all this,
inflammation. Sorry, just had to think of something else.
Just glycogen storage, bro.
Yeah.
All depletion. So yeah, just it's fun to talk about it, and of course, I mean that's why we do this. But I'm just saying, don't get so wrapped up. Don't let this prevent you. The obsession with details prevent you from actually just going in and doing the important things. It is fun to think about how can we make it ideal. And also like at our stage, we've all been lifting over a decade at this point. A lot of it is we're interested in this because it's how can we help our clients get to their goals faster. I've said this on a few different podcasts. Maybe you can get to your, peak physique in 5 years instead of 8 years or something like that. You can like speed it up. But we're not talking, a 300% difference or something because you decided to do a volume progression.
Yeah. No, I think that's completely right. And I often have that discussion with clients about realistic progression and things like this in terms of, I don't know, sometimes they want more. And I'm just like, you couldn't commit to training more times a week. Like theoretically, yeah, sure. If you were doing 6 times a week and you had my lifestyle, potentially you could grow that little bit better, but it is marginal. It's not going to be like night and day difference. And this is why whenever people bring up the argument of, okay, how do these low volume guys grow? If like for them, I mean, that's maybe minimum effective volume, or they may be at maximal adaptive volume. And that is just, so maybe I'm growing marginally quicker than them, and they could marginally grow quicker. You're never going to know. It's not night and day difference. Muscle growth is so slow, so you're not going to be able to identify that in an easy period of time. So I also like the idea that Jacob brought up in terms of people being put into like dogmatic camps in terms of like being high volume guys or low volume guys. It's not a case of that. It's like the appropriate dose for the individual, for their goals, what they can commit at their kind of level, which is why I like to auto-regulate from minimum effective, because it's kind of like, well, what can you give it and what do you want to give it? Because I don't want to push you just for the sake of it. If you're happy milking out a bit slower progress and it's a bit more sustainable for you, that's totally fine. But a lot of the people I work with kind of aspire for maximal, and so I'm like, right, let's make you a robot. Let's structure your day by day and as best we can, then can maximize their results, and they can be surprised by how much they can gain, but it's not the same for everyone. So yeah, it's some really interesting points.
Sure.
Yeah, I just quickly want to go back to the discussion about load progression, but I think Steve brought up a lot of important points, that the rate of progress is going to be, markedly different, not only due to somebody's lifestyle and everything they've got going with their nutrition and just their consistency in the gym, but their training experience, their level of advancement, all those sorts of things. And we know that it slows down over time, but for the most part, when we get bigger, we get stronger, and there should be a progression in strength. And I think when we're assessing not only the effectiveness of the training strategy and the approach that we adopt, we should be looking at a number of metrics, because measuring hypertrophy is fucking nuanced, measurement, and we don't have the best of techniques, especially available to coaches and people out there, unless you have access to a lab, which I'm guessing most of the audience and listeners don't. Means that we're going to need to look at things quite holistically, and it's very much a guessing game for the most part. So I always like to assess not just scale weight when somebody's looking to build muscle. That's obviously one proxy, but there are so many things that influence body mass, such as the nutritional status, water retention, gut residue, all those sorts of things. And for females, their monthly cycle, but we should be looking to training performance and seeing an increase in repetition strength across multiple sets and exercises, because strong looks strong. As you mentioned earlier, Dave, you see a lot of these big guys who, irrespective of the volumes they're doing, they're using quite heavy weights in the gym and they're quite jacked. So there's a reason that people need to add more weight to the bar, and that's generally because they get bigger. And that's a discussion for another day on, which came first, the chicken or the egg. But yeah, we need to be looking at training performance. I think looking to the visuals, because just getting stronger in the gym doesn't always correlate to muscle growth either, especially if you're gaining significant amount of weight at a rate that is disproportionate to your propensity to build muscle. We need to be looking at scale weight in conjunction with the visuals and the training performance. And the best proxy, in my opinion, for muscle growth is not any one of those things independent of the other. It's an increase in scale weight with the same or very similar body fat percentage over time, with noticeable improvements in visuals and a significant increase in repetition strength across multiple sets. So not just improving your 1RM strength, but improving, your 5RM across 3 sets, for example. You probably wouldn't be able to perform a 5-rep max, on 3 sets without dropping load. But, generally we want to see your rep strength in the moderate to high rep ranges going up with the same or even lower RPEs. And that's a really good proxy that you're building tissue, and it's, that's neural gains aside, but that combined with your scale weights going up over the course of months and years, and when you assess your scale weight in conjunction with visuals, your performance, and you haven't gained a stupid amount of body fat, if you're looking better at the same weight, at a heavier weight over time, then chances are you've built muscle. And I think Steve's a really good example of that. His body fat hasn't shot up too much, but if you were to compare Steve's scale weight now, I'm not exactly sure what it is, Steve. Are you nearing 190 pounds?
Nearing 195.
Yeah, 195 pounds now. Let's say Steve's body fat percentage is around 12 to 14%. If you look 3 years ago, at 12 to 14%, what did you weigh back then, Steve? Maybe 185
like
pounds?
180. Yeah.
Right, 180 pounds. And let's look at, say, your squat strength in the rep ranges of 5 to 10 across 3 to 5 sets. What was it when you were 180 pounds?
Fuck knows. My form's better now, so.
Okay, so form's better.
Probably not that different.
So you're lifting much more at all?
I actually don't know. I'd have to look back in my logbooks. I'm ruining this for you, Jacob. I'm lifting way more.
Yeah.
Your whole theory's out the window, Jacob.
Yeah, my theory's out the window. But I'm going to guess that, well, irrespective of whether you've added more weight to the bar, if your range of motion has increased, the total amount of work performed has increased, and you're likely not only maintaining that strength progression on that lift, but you're doing more volume for your quads across the board, meaning that you have a higher level of fatigue, within the microcycle, which would mask your ability to express your strength. So yeah, I would dare say that if you were to use the same volumes that you were using previously, you'd probably see your squat performance shoot up massively. But nonetheless, I think that is the best way to assess hypertrophy over the long term. And it really is a patient man's game. And I think that rate of progress will, again, vary markedly depending on the individual and their consistency over the years. And when you're like Steve and you're dialing everything in and you're measuring all of the important proxies, super consistent with not only training and diet, but your measurement techniques and minimizing confounding variables when you're taking assessments, all those sorts of things, and you're more importantly keeping a log of that, you can identify muscle growth, but it's just not as simple as what many people think when they say, oh yeah, just gain at a rate of 0.5 to 1% of body weight per month, and that's that. It's quite nuanced, and there's my thoughts on the process.